So, welcome again to the second part of our presentation. So for this presentation, we will now go into another aspect of cycles and patterns, still focusing on reproductive cycles. So for this presentation, we will go into types of reproductive cycles according to the dominant stage of the reproductive cycle or of the life cycle. For the first type of the reproductive cycle, according to the dominant stage, we have the Diplontic life cycle. So from the term itself, it is the Diplontic stage that is dominant. This is true to some organisms such as your Chlamydomonas. So for Chlamydomonas, we have two types of reproduction, specifically your sexual reproduction and your asexual reproduction. So during the asexual reproduction, usually a single mature cell of Chlamydomonas would undergo mitosis. So you have in there cell division occurring, and in that way it is able to produce zoospores which can grow into a mature cell of the organism. Other than asexual reproduction, your Chlamydomonas may as well undergo sexual reproduction. The sexual mature cell of Chlamydomonas would contain gametes. These gametes may fuse with the gametes of other Chlamydomonas such that zygote formation occurs after fertilization. The zygote may be encapsulated in the zygospore. The zygospore may undergo meiosis, producing zoospores upon its rupture. The zoospores coming from the ruptured zygospore can now grow into mature cells or mature Chlamydomonas. Studying the life cycle of Chlamydomonas, you can see that it is the haploid version or the zoospores that are actually dominant. The zygote or the diploid stage of the organism is only being formed very briefly, and it is the zoospores or it is the haploid stage that we usually observe. For the second type of life cycle, according to the dominant stage, we have your Diplo Haplontic life cycle. So from the name itself, Diplo Haplo, there is an alternation of generation or equal dominance between the Diplontic stage and the Haplontic stage. So in this Diplohaplontic life cycle of alternation of generation, we will encounter terms such as your sporophyte or the diplontic stage and gametophyte or the haplontic stage. For the sporophyte, it is the spore-producing stage in the life cycle. So when we say spores, these are the ones that germinate to develop the haploid gametophyte independently. The sporophytic stage or the sporophyte would contain spores. These spores germinate to develop the haploid gametophyte independently, and these spores are considered as diploid. On the other hand, you also have your gametophyte or the haplontic stage of this life cycle. This gametophyte is the gamete-producing stage in the life cycle. So the gametes should combine with another gamete to form the diploid stage. In such case, your gametes are haploids or part of the haplontic stage. To better appreciate diplohaplontic life cycle, let us look into illustrations or examples, such as your ferns and mosses. In this illustration, you have in here the life cycle of your bryophytes or your mosses. Your mosses can usually be found along rocks, walls, and tree barks, and oftentimes found or abundant during the wet season. So in this illustration, let us start with the female gametophyte. This female gametophyte, from the term itself, a gametophyte is in the haplontic stage. However, at the top portion of the gametophyte, you have what we call as your mature sporophyte. So this structure, the mature sporophyte, contains the diploid stage of the organism. In this mature sporophyte, specifically at the end or at the head structure, there is a capsule we call as your sporangium. This sporangium can undergo spore dispersal, releasing the spores. These spores are the starting point of gametophytes as presented in this illustration. So the spores can either grow into a protonema or a gametophore, and then producing buds further resulting into either female or male gametophyte. This male and female gametophyte can grow into antheridia and archegonia respectively. The antheridia and the archegonia are houses of the sperm and the egg respectively. Your antheridia carries the sperm while the archegonia carries the egg cell. During fertilization, the sperm would escape the antheridia and would find its way to the archegonia. When the sperm reaches the egg, fertilization may occur within the archegonium. Such fertilization will now result to a zygote. The zygote is then considered as part of the sporophytic stage or the diploid stage. Always remember that a zygote is always diploid. So this zygote is now part of the sporophytic stage. Growing into an embryo, it is now called a young sporophyte until such time that it will grow into a female gametophyte bearing the sporangium. From this illustration, you can see the alternation of generation or the dominance of each stage of life cycle. Presented in the blue line or along the blue arrows are the haploid cycle or the gametophytic cycle, and presented pink arrows or pink line is the diploid cycle or the sporophytic stage of the bryophytes. It can be observed that there is almost the same dominance or occurrences of either the haploid or the diploid stage. Now we go to the last type of reproductive cycle according to the dominant stage, the diplontic life cycle. So from the name itself, diplontic, the dominant stage would be the diplontic stage. This is true to human life cycle. As we presented from our earlier presentation, a higher complex organism could contain either a somatic or body cell or germ or sex cells. In human beings, we are mainly comprised of the somatic or body cells. However, in our reproductive organs, we can find our sex cells. Observing the human body cell alone, it is mostly comprised of somatic cells or body cells which are diploid cells. Although inside or within our reproductive organs, we produce sex cells, this would usually occur during short periods of time as compared to the production of body cells or mitosis that is occurring within our bodies. The diplontic cycle may also be observed among higher plant organisms such as your angiosperms or your flowering plants. Try to imagine or observe a flowering plant, whether it is a sunflower, a rose, or any of your favorite flowers. Most of the structures that you see or you have imagined from a flowering plant is the diplontic stage or as well comprised of the somatic or the diploid cells. What we observe when we imagine a plant is the diplontic stage because it is the dominant stage. So the leaves, the flowers that you see are actually diploid cells. Therefore, angiosperms or flowering plants are as well considered to be having a diplontic life cycle. Within the flowers, which is considered the reproductive organ of the plant, we can actually further observe the production of gametes or the sex cells. The male gamete is encapsulated in the pollen grain while the female gamete is being produced in the zygote of the plant. So reproduction among angiosperms may occur when the male gamete contained in the pollen grain reaches the stigma of the flower, producing pollen tube such that it reaches the egg cell that is present in the ovary. So the fusion of the pollen tube and the egg nucleus produces the zygote. The zygote that is formed from the fertilization or from the fusion of the male and the female gamete will now develop into the future seedling or the future mature plant. Those are the three different types of reproductive cycle according to the dominant stage. To give us a recap, again, let us review all of them. We have diplontic, haplontic, and haplodiplontic. For the diplontic stage, Thus, the dominant stage would be the diploid multicellular organisms, and this is usually present among higher animals and among higher plants such as your angiosperms. The next one, the haplontic life cycle. For the haplontic life cycle, the haploid single cell or multicellular organism is the dominant stage of such organism. This is usually present among most fungi and some algae. The last one, the Diplohaplotic or the haplodiplontic life cycle, wherein both the haploid multicellular organism and the diploid multicellular organism shares dominance in the stages or dominant stages in terms of life cycle. And this is observed in lower plants such as your mosses and your ferns and in some algae.